This crime became one of the most controversial and challenging for Iowa law enforcement officials. It was a self-defense killing. But the more investigators delved into the circumstances, the more confusing the story seemed. A string of suspects flashed before the detectives, but there was not a single serious clue. Years passed, until there were doubts that the whole case is built on lies. Today, we will try to understand the circumstances of the events that completely turned Tracy Roberts' life upside down. In 1998, the Roberts family from Chicago moved to the small town of Early, Iowa. The couple's names were Tracy and Michael. The young woman was an American, and the man was a native of Australia. They lived as a young family and seemed decent people to everyone in the local community. This was a second marriage for both of them. Tracy had a son from a previous relationship. Michael was a true computer genius who ran a home-based IT business. The man had many ideas that he planned to implement. Tracy was just fun and outgoing. The woman was a homemaker, exercised, and always looked great. The couple met on the internet. They had a stormy romance. Just 18 days after meeting in person, they got married. Later in the marriage, 2 children were born, a son and a daughter. The family seemed to be very happy. Many people liked Michael's determination, such as their neighbor, a realtor with whom they had worked together on several lucrative deals. Her name was Mona, and she was willing to do anything to continue working with Michael. It seemed to be mutual. Mona said that her 20-year-old son, named Dustin, was very withdrawn and could not find a job. He would apply for one job or the other, but he couldn't keep it for long. Then Michael suggested that the woman take the guy under her wing and see what he was good for. It sounded like an interesting proposition, so the realtor agreed. The man began to teach Dustin the intricacies of his business, took him on vacations and to church, supported the young man in every way possible. In general, Michael was considered a kind, pleasant, responsive person. His wife was also considered sweet and sociable. The couple raised 3 children. Tracy was engaged in the house and children, while her husband worked. He was often not at home when he was on a business trip. Of course, no one ever thought that such a situation could happen to this family. It happened on the evening of December 13, 2001, in the town of Early. In a local home, 35-year-old mother Tracy and her children were preparing for dinner. Food was heating up in the kitchen, and on the second floor she was filling the bath water for her 1-year-old daughter. At this time, her 2 older sons, ages 3 and 11, were sitting near the television in the bedroom of her oldest son, Bert. Suddenly, the boys heard their mother's exhaustive screaming. It was very exciting and frightening, so the oldest of the children, Bert, rushed to his mother's scream to see what was wrong. He saw Tracy trying to come through the doorway into his room, but someone grabbed her by the hair and literally dragged her back into the hallway. The woman had her young daughter in her arms, whom she barely had time to hand to her son when a struggle with her attacker ensued. Tracy slammed the door behind her, behind which rustling and loud struggling could be heard. Then the boy heard the woman's wheezing and again muffled cries for help. The son was badly frightened and did not know what to do. Then came a short period of silence, followed by a gunshot. His mother survived the attack. She was able to fight off the perpetrators. One of them was killed and the other escaped. An 11-year-old boy called 911 around 7 p.m. He reported that unauthorized men had broken into his home and attacked his mother. Law enforcement officers realized this was no joke and immediately drove to the address in question. At this point, it was completely unclear what had happened to Tracy as well as her 3 children. More than 30 kilometers to the house with the victims flew in a matter of minutes. Medics met the sobbing children, as well as the distraught mother outside the house. Tracy kept yelling that the perpetrator was upstairs and pointed them to the stairs. But medics, by protocol, could not enter the house until it had been inspected by police and given the go-ahead that it was safe. They began to render aid to the woman. Then police officers arrived. They went up to the second floor and found a young man lying in a pool of blood. He was dead. There was no one else inside. Tracy was conscious, but was gasping for air. So the medics immediately put her in a car and took her to the nearest medical center. It all looked like an unexpected, violent crime, but more complications were ahead. The entire family felt confused. There were a colossal number of questions that no one could answer. Police officers joined the investigation to solve this difficult puzzle. The incident has stirred up the small town of Early, where it all happened. It was a very quiet and peaceful village where nothing like this had ever happened. There are only 500 local people here, and everyone knows each other. The police interviewed the victim's eldest son. The 11-year-old boy said that he saw someone attacking his mother and prevented her from entering the nursery, pulling her back by the hair. The son, who was initially stunned, had no choice but to fight back if his mother to protect herself and the other children. He took a baseball bat and prepared to attack the first person who entered his room. When the noise died down, all he could hear was his mother's heavy breathing and wheezing. After a while, the child heard the voices of two men outside. They began to drum on the door. Then the frightened boy began to scream, using all the foul words he knew frightened the criminals. A stomping and men's shouts about a gun broke up outside the door. More than a dozen gunshots rang out, and then the door was opened by his mother. He almost hit her with the bat as he tried to fight back against whoever burst into the room. He was happy it was finally over and called 911. Upon hearing what had happened, a family friend, Mona, rushed over. She was trying to find her 20-year-old son, Dustin, who was friends with the family. His car was parked in the driveway, but by the time the woman arrived, the entire area, including her son's car, had been cordoned off. She was not allowed inside the Roberts' home. The woman asked the law enforcement officers present where her son was, to which they replied that he was dead. The boy, whose mentor was the head of the household, was lying in a pool of blood outside a second-floor bedroom. Tracy shot him to death. It happened in the course of a struggle over the boyfriend's attack. The police officers did not give Mona any information. They wouldn't let her say goodbye to her son, nor would they go detail about what exactly happened here. The woman was left in complete ignorance. At this time, 20 kilometers from her home, Tracy finally regained consciousness in the hospital and was able to breathe normally. There were marks on the woman's neck that looked like strangulation marks. The victim of the attack told police officers what happened that night. According to the mother of three, she was running a bath on the second floor when she heard a noise downstairs. The woman thought her husband had come home early from a work trip and went out to look, but she saw two men. They started upstairs. When Tracy reached her oldest son's room with the girl and handed the girl to him, she also tried to run into the room and close the door behind her, but she was grabbed by her hair and pulled into the hallway. One of her attackers then grabbed her pantyhose and began choking her. In the process, Tracy lost consciousness and the perpetrators were distracted, and when she woke up, she heard Bert screaming outside the door. She realized this was the perfect moment to act, so she got up and ran to the gun safe that was next to the bed in the master bedroom. The intruders caught up with her, but by some miracle the woman managed to dial the code and pull out a gun. Tracy pointed the barrel at them and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened because the gun was on safety. However, the attackers were confused and that was enough for the gun to go off after the next pull. She was momentarily stunned by the pop. She continued firing in the direction of attackers until smoke filled the entire room. Tracy did not see the perpetrators, but she heard footsteps running away from the house. Eventually, one perpetrator fell, and the second perpetrator fled. The woman also heard frightened children calling her name and headed to her son's room. As she opened it, she narrowly dodged a blow from her son with a bat to the head, who tried to defend himself. But most importantly, the kids were fine. By this point, the smoke had cleared in the master bedroom, and Tracy saw 20-year-old Dustin still alive on the floor. According to her, the boy started to rise. At this point, the woman drew her gun again and ordered him to stay where he was, as she was in shock and just wanted it stop. She yelled at him not to get up or move, but Dustin, who was her friend Mona's son, disobeyed and started to get up and headed towards her. Fearing for her safety and that of her children, she fired several more shots, after which Dustin fell again and was killed. There was no trace of the second offender. Tracy said that Dustin had come to their home earlier that day, and upon learning that her spouse was on a business trip, he stood on the porch for a long time and would not leave. He acted very strangely, and Tracy literally had to close the door in front of him. According to the victim's description, the second person involved in the crime was tall, with dark hair, about 30 years old, but she did not get a good look at his face. Tracy's husband, Michael, was on a business trip to Minneapolis that night. It was completely unclear why the guy he took under his wing attacked his spouse and children with an accomplice. The second attacker was still at large, and he could very well come back and take revenge. So Tracy was terrified. The woman was afraid to go into the house and be alone. She could not sleep peacefully, worried only about the safety of her family. However, the second perpetrator could not be for a long time. All the police relied on was a blurred description provided to them by the victim of the attack. They began to study Dustin's social circle, trying to understand with whom he could have gone to the Roberts family home. Many considered Tracy a real hero afterward. Tracy's story almost became a national pride. The woman gave several interviews to reporters. In front of the cameras, she and her husband Michael held hands and she calmly said, "I did what I had to do to protect my family." She was applauded by the entire auditorium, and many considered her actions a justifiable homicide. Tracy was brave, able to protect not only herself, but also her children. She was compared to a bear. However, police officers are not used to taking their word for it, so they began to analyze everything that happened, as they considered the story not entirely convincing. And the more the officers delved into the case file, the more controversial became the personal woman who killed the attacker. Despite the full support Tracy received from the beginning of this case, there were a few people for whom what happened was a tragedy. The mother of the boy who was shot was going through the most difficult time of her life. The whole thing literally broke her heart. For her, all the circumstances of the murder that the victim described made no sense. The mother had nightmares about this attack in which her son died. At the same time, the mother of the boy who was shot dead, Mona, was being interviewed by the media. She was shocked by what had happened. Dustin was not evil, on the contrary, a kind guy. He never showed aggression towards other people, did not have a criminal record, and there was not a single prerequisite for him to attack the Roberts. However, Dustin had social adjustment problems. He even went to a psychologist together with his mother. It was hard for the boy to find friends at school. He was often bullied by his peers and was not invited to parties and holidays. Mona went with him from doctor to doctor, but they all gave different diagnoses and didn't say anything specific. Could this have spiraled into aggression simply because the teenager couldn't cope and snapped? Tracy admitted to the police that she was always afraid of Dustin. She wasn't just uncomfortable around him. She was scared, unsafe, even in the presence of her husband. She avoided meetings with the young man and under no circumstances agreed to leave him with the children. The woman was sure that he would hurt them. These accusations shocked Mona. She had no idea that her friend was having such difficulties with her son. It seemed to her that everything seemed quite the opposite. The police, after examining the crime scene, concluded that Dustin had no motive for the brutal attack, only if it was planned as a robbery. There were quite a few valuables in the Roberts house. Therefore, Tracy assumed that the juvenile delinquents wanted to get rich by stealing cash or, for example, one of Michael's collectible weapons. However, the actions of the criminals did not look like an attempted robbery. They did not even take the money and jewelry, which were lying plain sight, and did not try to remove jewelry from Tracy when she lost consciousness from strangulation. They her immediately, as if violence was their goal. They didn't try to rape her. Could the attack have been motivated by a sex crime? Either it was an old grudge or just an act of unmotivated aggression. None of this made sense to the acquaintances and family of the guy who was shot. Despite his problems, he didn't look like someone capable of a violent crime. Pretty quickly, the police found a likely clue as to the motive for the attack. According to Tracy and her spouse, she had already been assaulted recently. Sometime before the family home invasion, a woman was sexually assaulted in a dentist's office while under anesthesia. She woke up in the process. The doctor tried to persuade the woman to keep quiet and not tell anyone about the incident. In return, he promised to go to medical center to solve his sexual problems and to pay the victim $150,000 in compensation. Tracy told her spouse about it. He insisted on going to the police. Just 2 days after trying to strangle the mother of 3, she was to find herself in court against her dentist, whom she was going to accuse of rape. He was probably the second man who broke into her home and wanted to get rid of the victim of his harassment so that she could not testify against him. However, as investigators found out, the dentist had no connection to Dustin and had a solid alibi. He was at work. After that, the woman remembered another man who might well have wanted her dead. He was much more similar to the main suspect in the crime than the dentist. That man turned out to be John Pittman, who was Tracy's first husband. They met him at Northwestern University in Chicago, where they both studied medicine. John was a fourth-year medical student interning at the Chicago Teaching Hospital, and 19-year-old Tracy was a freshman radiology student. He was very bossy and aggressive, but Tracy had an overbearing father her entire childhood, so she was used to this attitude and thought it was normal. Tracy married him. They later moved to Denver, Colorado, and there she gave birth to a son. When her first spouse tried to total control everything in her life, she considered it normal. Over time, however, the marriage began to crack at seams. Tracy recounted that he often tortured her, especially during intimacy. Eventually, she grew tired of enduring the physical abuse. They separated in '92, after which the issue of custody of their 3-year-old son Bert came up. However, the boy confessed to his mother that his father had molested him. The result was a heated custody dispute in court. There was no evidence regarding the molestation of the son, but the woman convinced everyone present at the trial. The son was living with his mother at the time. The custody trial had clearly been protracted and was ongoing at the time of the attack. Therefore, John Pittman looked a likely candidate for being an accessory to the crime, or a contract killer who had hired the two hit men. Even little Bert believed that his father could have been involved in the attack. Police officers turned to their colleagues in Virginia, where John lived, to ascertain whether or not the man had an alibi for the crime. And it turns out he had a solid alibi. He was working at the clinic at the time of the crime. John himself denied having anything to do with the crime, and there was no evidence against him. At that, he was a successful plastic surgeon with an impeccable reputation, and none of his acquaintances simply did not believe that John could molest his son or kill his ex-wife, to whom he had not cared for a long time. But John had not yet been written off and was considered a suspect. Months passed, and the case never progressed. Tracy was even more worried. She didn't feel safe as long as the second attacker was still at large. She was afraid he would come back and take revenge on her. During this period, police officers became interested in another suspect. Investigators turned their attention to Tracy's second spouse, Michael. On closer examination, it turned out that the marriage had long since died out, and there were no longer any old feelings between the lovers. Could Michael have simply tried to get rid of an unwanted spouse? Many people supported this theory, and not without reason. The woman's eldest son, Bert, told the terrible truth about his stepfather. The man was very strict, often cruelly punished the boy, invented elaborate punishments for the slightest provocations. Tracy herself, for some reason, ignored such aggressive behavior of her spouse and did not protect the children. Perhaps Tracy was used to such behavior since childhood and did not see as a big deal. In favor of the suspicions of the investigators spoke Michael's actions in the hospital when he came to visit his surviving relatives. That alerted them. The man seemed genuinely surprised to see them safe and sound, apparently from the fact that this was not part of his plans. However, Michael had an ironclad alibi. He was on a business trip in another city, which was confirmed by CCTV footage. The man was tested on a polygraph, but he failed the test and obviously didn't say anything. Detectives believed there was a high probability that he was involved in organizing the attack. For a whole year of work, the investigators never came close to proving the guilt of the perpetrator, but the spouse of the victim behaved really strangely. For example, he never told his wife about the results of the polygraph, didn't sympathize with her at all. This caused a new wave of suspicion on her part, especially since the woman later found out about the failed polygraph. Tracy became really paranoid. She believed that both spouses were in cahoots and wanted to get rid of her in order to get sole custody of the children. She told her suspicions to the sheriff and backed them up with Michael's words that he had spoken in a dream about the conspiracy. The man was afraid that their conspiracy would soon be exposed. Therefore, Tracy was certain that both spouses were indeed conspiring against her. Detectives began to study Michael in more detail and found out that at the time of the crime, the man's IT business was on the verge of failure, and he had small debts. But the couple had life insurance policies worth millions of dollars, so the husband could have tried to get rid of Tracy to get money to solve all his problems. Plus, he was just as close to Dustin and could have coaxed the young man to help him do it. But it was only speculation. No evidence of Michael's involvement. The investigators had no evidence. Meanwhile, relations between the Roberts couple were heating up. In 2004, 3 years after the attack, the Roberts' marriage broke up. The divorce was filed by the husband. Until now, law enforcement officials had no grounds to arrest the likely killer. By this point, Tracy and her children had moved to Omaha after the divorce. She had changed not only her residence, but her job and even her name, hiding from everyone and fearing another attack. Her friend Mona, the mother of the murdered Dustin, also moved, but to another city, taking her daughters with her. It turned out that this tragedy took the life not only of Dustin, but also of his father. A year after the tragedy, on Thanksgiving Day 2002, a man took his own life right on his son's grave. The father was destroyed and heartbroken over Dustin's death, over the slanted stares of people who thought his son was a dangerous criminal. Mona was completely devastated by the string of deaths, but vowed that she would clear her son's name of all the dirt. She continued to puzzle over what had really happened that day to her son and why he had ended up at Tracy's house. The mother just didn't want to believe that he really wanted to hurt the people who were his mentors. The young man trivialized the relationship with this family very much, as he had problems with social adaptation, and with them he could feel calm and was very grateful to Michael. The woman even wanted to file a wrongful death lawsuit in an attempt to hold Tracy Roberts responsible for Dustin's death and find out what happened that night. Her attorneys began their own investigation and picked up on inconsistencies in the victim's story as she recounted it over and over again. According to one version of Tracy's story, she recognized Dustin immediately. In another case, she did not learn the identity of the deceased until later. According to her different testimony, she fired from different positions. Because of these inconsistencies and confusion over minutiae, the lawyers concluded that her story was a lie. On the day of the murder, Dustin's mother Christmas shopping. She called home to see if Dustin was awake because he had an important meeting scheduled that day. Her daughter answered and told her Michael had already left. Mona rejoiced, thinking it was a good sign that he was awake and off on important business himself. But later, Mona got a call from her nephew informing her that something had happened at their friends Michael and Tracy's house. Mona snapped and drove over there. She thought that Tracy and Michael had killed each other, but there was no way she could have guessed that her son had been killed. Mona also stated that Tracy herself had invited her son to her house the day before to help her with a case, and she assumed that this was how the woman lured the boy to her house to kill him. The murdered boy's mother was sure Tracy had something to hide. However, no one listened to Mona until 7 years after the Roberts home invasion, when the investigative team in the department changed. The story was reanalyzed, after which the officers also had suspicions that Tracy was not the heroine who saved her children, but could be a lying murderer. There was not a single sign of forced entry or attempted burglary in the house. How then could two people have gotten into the house? Dustin had 9 gunshot wounds on him. The guy was literally shot at point-blank range, leaving no chance of survival, and there was no sign of the second perp at all. The new investigators decided to talk to Tracy's first husband. It turned out that he was nothing like the monster she made him out to be. The man reported that it was she herself who had bouts of aggression, to the point where she once pointed a gun at him and threatened to kill him. As a result, she fired a shot into the ceiling, after which her spouse was forced to call the police. However, she told investigators that she had tried to take her own life, so she was able to get away with it. It was Tracy, not John, who turned out to be the aggressive and unfaithful one in the marriage. Emptied his bank cards. He even hired a private investigator because of his suspicions, and he confirmed that numerous lovers of Tracy were leaving the house while the spouse was at work. As a result, it was the man who filed for divorce because he began to fear his own wife and was tired of putting up with her antics. He was worried about his son, who was growing up in an unhealthy environment with an insane mother, so he fought for custody of him, which infuriated Tracy. Although she tried to turn her son against his father, she had no evidence of abuse by the first spouse. She realized that the ex-spouse now had a better chance of getting custody than she did, and perhaps that's what drove her to commit the crime to frame John. A dentist who allegedly raped a woman while working had in fact been harassed by her for a long time and was prepared to prove it. Cameras were installed in his office, and the videos confirmed his words. It turned out that Tracy, upon learning of this, withdrew her lawsuit against the dentist the day before the crime. And second spouse Michael, whom Tracy accused of beating and harassing her after the separation, also denied those words in front of detectives. He accused his wife of constant cheating and a nasty temper. He put up with it all because of the children, but eventually divorced her. Michael stated that he was a strict father but never hit his wife and children, and also claimed that Tracy turned the children against him. After the divorce, the man moved to California and focused on his business, and was able to get it off the ground. The woman seemed to slander everyone around her. She tried to make herself look like a victim of abuse by all the men around her, but the opposite was true. The investigators were sure that the account of the events of December 13, 2001 was exactly the same lie Tracy had made up. They needed to meet the victim of the attack in person and talk to her. But in the meantime, the mother of three didn't just move to another state and change her personal information. She kept changing her contact information about herself on a regular basis. While they were trying to locate the woman, police interviewed all of Tracy's close friends in an effort to understand her motives. A friend of the new suspect provided important clues when she was pressed by officers. She was helping Tracy clean the house after the attack when she showed her where she had started shooting Dustin. What the woman was telling her simply couldn't be true. Everything described was physically impossible to replicate. How an ordinary, frail woman could take out two men so deftly. Of it made sense. The police were forced to re-examine the entire list of evidence. Among them was a very old computer that had been found in the back seat of Dustin's car. Tracy thought it was the main evidence of the robbery, since the equipment belonged to her husband. But it was unclear why Dustin had stolen it specifically, when there were much more valuable and compact items in the house, were much easier to steal. For example, money and jewelry that were lying in prominent places. A pink notebook was found on the front seat of Dustin's car, in which the guy described the plan of the crime shortly before his death. It said that it included the murder of Tracy Roberts, and the customer of the crime, strangely enough, was first husband John Pittman. But the police found one oddity in these notes. There were too many details of what happened the young man simply could not have known before the attack. And yet this was his handwriting. It was as if Dustin had written it under dictation, under some pretext or threat of a weapon. Dustin's mother didn't recognize this notebook. Plus, it was pink, more like a woman's, and Dustin didn't like that color and would never buy himself a notebook like that. Besides, he never kept any kind of diary at all. There were no other entries in the notebook except for the crime plan, which also looked odd. It looked like it had just been bought and used only once to make the appropriate notes. It was becoming increasingly obvious that this notebook could have been given to the boyfriend by Tracy herself to stage the crime. According to the new version of the investigation, the young man who was shot was not the attacker, but was the victim of a lying criminal. He was easily suggestible, gullible, and Tracy took advantage of that. By this time, the woman had been found. Tracy had already started having problems in her new place as well, namely with the authorities in the new town in Nebraska where she had moved earlier. She was accused of forging documents, her own identity. This was the reason for the search. The woman's apartment was inspected. The mother of 3 children was found disturbing materials on the computer. It was rather eccentric pornography. Pictures of the dead and weapons. 10 years after the murder, police officers managed to get to the truth. On July 27, 2011, they arrested a woman who was previously believed to be heroically protecting her children. And the main impetus for detectives were the memories of a friend helped Tracy to clean the house. And also, the victim's friend knew about Dustin's confession notebook, and detectives were able to figure out that all of these stories had indeed been written down earlier at Tracy's dictation. No signs of assault could be found in the house. The marks on the perpetrator were able to leave on her own. This was confirmed by the fact that they were minor abrasions, not life-threatening. The nature of the bullet wounds on the victim's body also did not match the description of the female killer. The episode describing Dustin trying to get up after shot several times looked completely absurd. After such wounds, he had already passed away. Experts who scrutinized the crime scene photos concluded, based on blood spatter, that Dustin did not get up. All the shots were fired from the top down while he was lying on the floor. That didn't fit Tracy's story about the attack either. She shot the guy when he posed no threat to her. However, the defense continued to insist that Tracy was saving her children. It was indeed a beautiful story that was primarily aimed at convincing the jury of the defendant's lies. Also, as the defense lawyers argued, much of the evidence was circumstantial. The trump card for the defense was to be Bert, the defendant's oldest son. He testified that he heard male voices outside the door and saw someone pull his mother away from the door. According to the teen, the intruder said his mother was dead and he would be next, through the door. He later saw the young man with bullet wounds trying to get up, just as the woman described. But the veracity of that testimony was questionable. According to the woman's first accounts at that moment, the nursery door was still closed, and the son simply could not have seen it. Therefore, the prosecutor believed that his mother had suggested all this to him. The prosecutor insisted that the defendant committed Dustin's murder to frame her husbands, put them behind bars, gain sole custody of the children, and full access to their money. They saw that as the primary motive for the crime. That same day, Tracy called Dustin in at gunpoint and forced him to make notes in a notebook, then shot him. And then staged an attack on herself, inflicted minor injuries on herself, and left her notebook and computer in his car. Even the medical examiner confirmed that with those injuries, she could not have lost consciousness, which also sounded contradictory. After a lengthy deliberation of the case, the jury found Tracy Roberts guilty of first-degree murder. The woman was sentenced to life in prison without parole. After the verdict was announced, Tracy burst into tears in court. But no one believed her tears, which were not even there. Once again, the woman played out the drama. Bert, who was convinced that his mother had saved the lives of all her children on that cold night and was behind bars illegally, was the hardest to bear. He still visits and supports her. Tracy's second husband took his children after a few years with the permission of the child welfare authorities and moved back to his homeland in Australia with his new wife. Tracy still maintains that she is innocent. She is serving her sentence at the Iowa State Correctional Institution for Women in Michelle Villa. If you liked this piece, support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Share your opinion in the comments as to whether you think Tracy is really the victim in this story who is wrongfully tried for murder, or if she staged the attack. I also suggest you watch these videos. Thank you all, and bye.